Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Queen's Gambit declined with the exchange variation, which is one of the most popular and one of the most instructive variations of the Queen's Gambit declined because it has so thematic plans and a very thematic pawn structure, one of the most thematic pawn structures in all of chess, the Carlsbad. And because it's played on all levels, strong players play it with both sides. So it's an opening which can teach you positional chess, strategical chess, and which can make you aware of how important a single weakness can be and how decisive a single weakness can be. Okay, the reason why I'm covering it from White's perspective, and this is going to be the only variation I cover from White's perspective, is because White is the one who chooses to get into the exchange, and White is the one who sort of decides on the nature of the position. Okay. So let's get into the opening. After White plays d4, Black responds with d5. We have the Queen's Gambit declined with e6. White continues with the move knight to c3. And as we know, the two ways to avoid the main lines of the Queen's Gambit declined are to either play the Alatortsev or the Tarrasch, which have been covered in two previous videos, so you can watch them if you want some nuances for Black. But most commonly, Black plays the move knight to f6, and now White is the one who chooses the exchange. A simple name, very descriptive, because White takes c takes d5, e takes d5. And here we have the pawn structure and the middle game, which we are going to be discussing throughout the video, because it really is a middle game, more so than an opening. So what has happened? As we know, in the position after the Queen's Gambit declined, Black concedes to playing the move e6 to support his center. What that does, it hems in the bishop on c8, and the bishop is pretty immobile. And in most variations of the QGD, this bishop is going to be the main strategic team around which Black's play is going to revolve. And you might be wondering, why in the world would White accept liberating that bishop with cd5, ed5, because the bishop is now free? Well, that's a concession because White has just helped Black improve his position, but on the other hand, White's play is going to be based around reducing the scope of that bishop and reducing the usefulness of that bishop. As we are going to see in the next few moves, this bishop will have no home in the position, and usually it's going to be Black's piece that gets traded off, and it's going to be Black's piece that doesn't really do much throughout the game. Okay, so let me just show you the first few moves of the opening to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So in this position, bishop g5 is the main move. White plays bishop g5 in order to play the move e3 after after he has developed his bishop, to make sure he solidifies his pawn structure, and more importantly, to be able to play the f1 bishop to d3. So in this position, Black can continue in several different ways. Only one is really sound, and that's the move bishop to e7, or two are really sound, c6 or bishop to e7. They are most often going to transpose. So bishop to e7, let's say, pawn to e3. In this position, Black should either play c6 or castles, let's say c6. And now White's play is going to be either playing queen c2 or bishop to d3. They have the same idea. So let's say bishop to d3. What you're doing with the move bishop to d3, you are restricting the scope of the bishop. Notice that White hasn't played the move knight to f3. Playing the move knight to f3 would be a strategic mistake. If knight f3, then bishop g4 is a great square for the bishop pinning the knight. Instead of knight to f3, by playing bishop to d3, White is saying your bishop is useless. It doesn't really want to go to d7, that's a square for the b8 knight. On e6, it's sort of restricting the play on the e-file, which is a semi-open e-file for Black, which Black wants to use. In this position, bishop to g4 doesn't really do much because it can be met with f3. So by playing bishop to d3, White is saying, well, you're simply not going to develop your piece to a good square. Now that's just one point of the opening, bishop to d3 and restricting Black's play. Now let's go over some of the basics. So after the move pawn to e6, you might be wondering, why doesn't White stop the Alatortsev and the Tarrasch? Because after knight to c3, if Black plays the Alatortsev, it's not that easy to play the exchange. However, you can transpose after the Alatortsev, and I'm going to show you why. So CD5, ED5 of course, and now obviously by playing the Alatortsev, black is taking away the G5 square from the bishop, but white can play the move bishop to F4, which is just as useful, and after C6, E3, we have a similar position in the Carlsbad pawn structure in which the bishop is simply on F4 instead of G5. So after something like bishop to F5, you might continue playing in the Alatortsev variation fashion with pawn to G4, which is the most principled move. But if you want a simple Carlsbad pawn structure playing for advantages, you can continue with bishop D3. There's nothing better than to take, so takes, queen takes, and you can see that the light squared bishop has been traded off, and after knight f6, knight f3, knight b to d7, we have the same position, we have transposed. The other thing which I have to note is that if you allow after knight to c3 the Tarrasch, then there is no more transposing to the exchange variation, you are playing the Tarrasch. Hence, why shouldn't white play cd5 immediately to stop the Tarrasch defense? Well, after cd5, ed5, knight c3, black doesn't have to play the move knight f6, and he doesn't want the pin with bishop g5, so black should just continue with the move c6. Now again, you don't have too many pleasant options. Bishop f4 is okay. Or you could continue with knight to f3, but you're not playing the same opening. Let's say knight to f3, bishop to f5 is already a problem. Black has managed to get his bishop to a more useful square. Let's say bishop to f4, bishop to d6 is one of the most active moves, doing what white has done, trying to trade off the good bishop. Bishop d6, queen to d6, e3, let's say knight to d7, bishop to d3, and we have a similar position. So this is what you can get. And there are tricks to play this, but it's better to play knight to c3 first and simply go with bishop g5. So I wouldn't be too afraid. For those of you who want to play the exchange QGD, I would just advise you to learn a line against the Tarrasch because that's better. Okay, now in the main line, after knight f6, takes, bishop g5, there's one question which has to be answered. Why doesn't black play bishop f5 immediately to stop bishop d3 and, more importantly, queen c2 ideas? Queen c2 is a more popular move. So what white wants to do is e3, queen to c2. Why doesn't black play the move bishop f5 immediately? This is a move with easy refutation, which you have to learn because you may see it on lower levels. What you do here is you simply take on f6, and after bishop takes on f6, if queen takes f6 where you are hanging the d5 pawn, if g takes f6, then queen to b3 forks d5 and b7, and white is basically in a winning position. So this is what has to be highlighted. Now let's focus on bishop to g5, and let's go over bishop e7, e3, c6, and bishop to d3, let's say. I want to talk about this pawn structure for a while. I'll actually flip to this board with no pieces. This is the Carlsbad pawn structure. In the 19th century, it has been considered winning for the side with the pawn majority, in this case, winning for black. That's the reason why the Caro-Kann was an unsound defense back then, because people didn't know about the ideas of playing against this pawn majority. So basically, if you are in the 19th century, this is positionally better for black, almost winning on a high level. But then the minority attack came along, and the minority attack is a strategic plan in the middle game, or a positional plan in the middle game, which revolves around a pawn minority attacking a pawn majority to induce weaknesses. And I'm going to try to show you an example. So let's look at this position. A minority attack is launching an attack on the tip of the pawn structure. So in this case, you don't have a c pawn. If you did, you would love to attack the d5 pawn. The tip of the pawn chain which you can attack in this case is the c6 pawn. And there are two scenarios you want to achieve. Scenario A, isolating a7 and d5, or isolating d5, or making c6 a backwards pawn, which is going to be an easy target. And I'm going to play idiot moves for black, just to show you how that works. b4 is the start of the minority attack. It's usually prepared with rook a to b1 and or a3 to support the pawn. One very important piece in the defense against the minority attack is going to be the e7 bishop. As you can see, the e7 bishop restricts b4, so the move has to be prepared. But let's say black doesn't know what he is doing. King to f8, a4, king to g8, b5. Now you have successfully launched a minority attack. Black has two options. He can either take or allow you to take. If he takes, you have isolated the d5 pawn, and this is going to be a structural weakness which is going to be very easy to exploit. This is not a normal IQP because it's blockaded by a pawn chain, so it's already fixed. White doesn't have to use a piece to blockade the pawn on d4 and then round it up. This is a very big weakness. And if, let's say, black wastes another move and you take on c6, b takes c6, you have now created a backward c6 pawn and an isolated a7 pawn. And one of the most common plans to exploit that is to use your c3 knight to jump into a4 and c5, blockade the pawn. Weaknesses have to be fixed first and then put pressure on it. You can double up your rooks on the c file, even a queen, and start putting pressure on c6. So the pawn structure we are going to be dealing with most often in the exchange Queen's Gambit declined is going to be this one. The Carlsbad is a very thematic pawn structure. The minority attack is one of the most common plans, but it's not the only one. Now, let's go over the two main moves. We have the exchange QGD, bishop g5, bishop e7, e3. In this position, black can either castle or play the move c6. They are going to transpose most of the time. Let's look at c6 first. In this position, white can either choose between bishop d3 or queen to c2. Queen to c2 is a more principled move, developing the queen. Knight b to d7, bishop to d3, castles, knight to f3. In the positions where bishop to d3 is played, the queen doesn't normally go to c2. Okay, rook to e8, castles, knight to f8. Black wants to open up his bishop and reroute the knight to g6, h3. h3 is a very important move because it restricts bishop to g4. That's a very important theme in the opening. So the bishop goes to e6, the only useful square, albeit meek. Rook a to b1, and now you can see what's going on. White is going to start a minority attack. The bishop on e7 for the moment is restricting the move b4, but white has reinforced it with rook to b1. Now let's say black makes a mistake. Let's say black plays knight to g6, which is not a good move, b4. And let's say black plays the move h6, bishop to f4, let's say rook to c8, b5. After b5, there really are no good options for black, and white is better. If you try pushing c5, then of course I am going to take. Let's say bishop takes. I can blockade the pawn in several different ways. Of course, I'm afraid of this battery, but I have time to move my queen. If he doesn't play c5, which is a bad move, and allows me to take with, let's say, let's play a random move, queen to e7. I take. If rook takes, then d5 is isolated and weak. If pawn takes, then we have what we were talking about. Knight a4, let's say rook to b8, knight to c5. And in this position, white is better. Okay, therefore, after rook a to b1, there are several ways to play against the minority attack. One of the most direct is to simply stop b4 by force. So a5 is the main move. After a5, white doesn't give up on the idea of the minority attack. White prepares it further, a3. So these two moves are usually going to lead to minority attack, and both are going to be required to continue. Knight 6 to d7. This is an exchange that black wants to do. Bishop takes. Queen takes, or bishop to f4, which is a more common move. You can decline it. Knight to g6 attacking the bishop. Bishop to h2, for example. Knight to b6. And now once again, you're looking forward to the move b4. But let's talk about the downside of the minority attack. If you in this position play b4, fine, you have started the minority attack, but you have given up a very important square to black. The c4 square can be used by the knight, and therefore we are often going to see knight d7, knight b6, knight c4. So when playing a minority attack, be aware of the weaknesses it leaves behind. Okay, the second position I want to be discussing is the position after castles instead of c6. So bishop to d3 for white is the most common move, knight b to d7. In this position, knight f3 and knight e2 can both be played. I'm going to discuss that in a second. Let's say knight to f3 and c6. So as you can see, they can transpose easily and usually do. In this position, white continues with queen to d2. We have the same position. Okay, now Let's talk about two main choices for white. Okay, so queen to c2, knight bd7, bishop to d3, castles. In this position, we have the main branching of the exchange variation, and this is where white decides what he wants to do. And this is the part where you have to learn a few move orders. The good thing about the exchange is that it's not theory heavy. You don't have to know the theory, you have to know the plans, you have to know the patterns, you have to know piece placement. The exact move orders, I mean, if you learn the first 10 moves, then after that, it's patterns that are going to be decisive. White's main choice is whether he wants to play knight f3 or knight e2. Now let's talk about the difference. Firstly, with knight f3, white goes for a minority attack. That's the main plan in knight f3 positions. After knight f3, black can be sure that white is going to attempt a minority attack if he wants to play the best plan possible. After knight to e2, white has several different options. Two main options after knight to e2 are A, to play f3 e4 to break in the center to attack the head of the pawn chain, maybe leaving himself with an IQP, but ideally leaving himself with 2 pawns in the center on d4 and d4. This is going to involve kingside castling and the slow preparation of e4, which we are going to see. The second option for white after playing knight to e2 is to castle queenside, which we are also going to look at, and start a kingside attack. Okay, let's focus on knight f3 first. Rook to e8, black wants to use his semi-open e-file. Castles, knight to f8, transferring the knight to g6, opening up the c8 bishop. Rook a to b1, starting a minority attack. a5. Let's just see an inferior option for black. Let's say he goes knight e4. This is a very common move which you are going to see. Bishop to e7, queen to e7, b4. The minority attack has succeeded. a6, trying to stop b5, but now a4. And whatever black does now, it's not easy to stop that. Let's say knight to g6, which is thematic, b5. And now what do? A takes b5, you have to do something. A takes b5, let's say bishop to g4, which is very active. You can take on e4 here. D takes, knight to d2 is very common. And in this position, you have no better option but to accept either a weakness on b7 or a weakness on c6. So if you go f5, let's say takes, and now white has what he wanted to achieve. He's going to plant the knight on c5, double stuff up on the c file, and attack the c6 weakness. But black is a good player. Black plays a5, a3, knight e4. And now the main way for black to play is to seek counterplay in the center while white is wasting time on a flank attack. And let's be honest, a few queenside weaknesses are not important if you can checkmate or create a deadly attack. So bishop e7, queen e7, bishop e4. This is an exchange you want to do with white. D takes e4, knight to d2. You don't want your bishop, you want to induce weaknesses. You are not going for an attack as white. Black has to seek dynamic play. You go for small advantages. f5, defending e4, and now b4. A takes b4, A takes b4, bishop to e6. And in this position, black is threatening infiltrations with rook a3. If the c3 knight moves rook a2, b5 can of course be played, but it's not that simple anymore. If you go b5, then c5 is a serious candidate. And you have to be careful. So this is the plan after knight to f3. White wants to play for the minority attack. In the middle game series, in a few months, I'm going to actually create a couple of videos on the Carlsbad and on the minority attack, which are not only going to be revolving the exchange QGD, but also the Caro-Kann and other openings. And I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about that. Okay, now let's look at knight to e2. Knight to e2 is the second option white has, and as we said, he can go for two things, f3, e4, or castles queenside and storm black's king. Rook e8, and here is the junction. So either castles kingside or queenside is going to decide the nature of the position. Let's cover queenside castling first. You may be wondering, well, after b5 is my king not weak? It's hard to prove. Knight f8, king b1, h6, bishop f4, knight e6, for example, bishop to e5, b5, h4, a5. Let's look at, this is a sample position. And one good thing which white has to remember is that any b4 advance helps white if the pawn is not on a4 yet. So what black should do before playing b4 is play a4, because if, let's give white a stupid move, if b4 here, then knight a4 basically stops the attack stops the counterplay. Okay, but after the moves such as a4, let's give white another stupid move, b4, now things get a bit more complicated. And white is in fact losing a piece here, so playing two stupid rook moves was not good. Okay, but this is a position you're going to be dealing with. And if we look at this, it's going to be similar to Sicilian type attacks, where white attacks on the king side, black attacks on the queen side. Whoever is faster usually wins, and every tempo counts. So if you want your exchange QGD positions to be crazy, play this as white. Again, there is no one rule about how to play this position. You have to learn the patterns. You have to learn stuff that happens after b4, what happens after a5, a4, b4. Can black break with c5? How fast are you to play f3, g4, g5? Because if you manage that, you'll basically win the game. Should you exchange your bishop for the f6 knight? Does your knight belong on g3, f5, or f4, g6, h5? Those things you should analyze in actual games. Okay, and the other plan for white is castling kingside, and after knight to f8, going f3, preparing e4. Bishop to e6, the only square the bishop can occupy, and rook a to e1. There are several different options. You can go rook c1, rook d1, rook f to e1. The main idea, though, is to push with e4 sooner or later, and this is going to be slightly more aggressive than the minority attack plans. Okay, rook to c8. King to h1, you want to safeguard this diagonal, basically. Knight 6 to d7, bishop takes, queen takes, and an exchange we saw before. Knight to f4 is a very useful square, enabled by playing knight e2. Queen d6, queen to f2, knight to g6, for example, knight takes, queen takes, e4. As soon as white manages to play e4, he is sharing the qualities of the semi-open, soon-to-be open e-file, or soon-to-be closed e-file, and he is pushing for central advantage instead of playing on the flank. So this is another way to play the position. Black, of course, has counterplay in the form of, for example, knight f4, bishop to c2. White has to be careful with playing e5, which is an advance you should think twice before playing, because black still has f6. Taking is also an option, but if you don't leave black with an isolated queen pawn, it's not recommended, because you are going to have an isolated queen pawn. And yeah, in this position, there's a lot of play going on. On the highest level, I think this is the most venomous way to play f3 and d4, but it's just one of the three main plans. So, okay, to summarize, the exchange variation is going to be played in the Carlsbad pawn structure. The three main plans for white are A, the Carlsbad minority attack on the queen side with rook b1, b4. B, castling queenside and after knight g to e2 and pushing for a kingside attack. Or C, castling kingside after knight g to e2 and going f3, going for the central break e4. All three plans are great. All three plans are defendable, of course, for black. So I would advise you, instead of learning theory, if you want to pick up something against the Queen's Gambit declined, learn one of these systems, learn the move orders, learn the patterns. The best way to do that is to analyze a bunch of games. Okay, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.